Beloveds, so before I hop into my reflection, I just want to give you the trigger warning now, or the content warning now, that this is going to be a sermon that may be a little bit different. Um, and it was birthed um, through a coincidence of the universe. And so I just want to give that to you now because I consider you my Rockville family. It's some hard truths, but some truths that need to be heard. So I'm going to start in a very specific way. You can join me if you want on this very first piece. You don't have to, but if you would like to, I ask you to put your right hand over your heart and say it with me, but don't unmute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The 4th of July has always been a complicated holiday for me. As a child, I was raised to celebrate this day because my grandfather was a soldier, a vet, a POW, and he had this purple heart that was his pride and joy from the time when he served in Korea. I think that the tension that I have always held around this holiday is the feeling of being a patriot versus the feelings as a Black person who is living through the complicated realities of America today. I remember during my childhood being in an elementary school, and myself and other children each morning, we were taught and then expected to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I remember learning that we must stand at attention with our hands over our hearts to show the pride and the honor it was to be an American. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I remember thinking that I didn't mind standing at attention because my grandfather had served so that I could be free. And as an adult, I think back on that young, naive Black child. The child I was then didn't understand the costs of freedom. The child I was then didn't understand what it meant to be a POW, or prisoner of war. The child that I was then didn't understand that my grandfather was held, tortured, and treated like he was less than a human. I don't think that I could understand the horrors that he had to witness and commit in the name of freedom. And then I think back to his purple heart. It was symbolic of more than just the physical wounds he returned home with. It was symbolic of the mental and emotional wounds that he carried on his heart for the rest of his life. That purple heart was about every war that had been fought before his. My grandfather was there on the ground fighting for his country because the Emancipation Proclamation happened. He was there on the ground because his ancestors had fought for this country when the country didn't love them and didn't consider them human. He had fought in a way that was his birthright as a poor Black man. He went to war because his parents and grandparents had been formerly enslaved and had fought for their freedom, and many of them didn't live to see the fruits of their sacrifice. And yet there are times when it is hard for me to say that I am proud to be an American. It's hard for me to be proud of a country that has hidden the deaths of over 1,500 missing Indigenous children who had been taken to residential schools because they were supposed to be assimilated like the good Negroes. It is hard to be proud when I know to this day that there are still missing and murdered Indigenous women and femmes that we never hear about because they are Indigenous. And it's much easier for us to swallow a story like the Disney version of Pocahontas than it is for us to take in the truth. It is hard to be proud when state sanctioned violence is impacting Black and brown bodies every day. It is hard to be proud when Black trans women and femmes are murdered because it's easier to get rid of your dirty little secret than it is to come out and be proud. It's hard to be proud when 22 years are considered justice and 9 minutes and 28 seconds were debated as heart disease or a drug overdose instead of what it really was. It is hard, it is hard to be proud to be an American when people that look like you are threatened by people that look like me. When my skin tone is a weapon and it's pulled out every time I walk into a room. It is hard to hear the truth. I know it is, but it is a truth that so many Americans live with. And today, we are barely scratching the surface. But if we are to emerge from this healed and healing, then there are more truths that must be said out loud. We must be dedicated to naming that truth so that we can start to heal and repair those wounds. America was built off the backs of Black, brown, Indigenous, Asian, and other people of color. And those are the stories and histories that folks don't like to teach. As an adult, I had to come to the hard realization that although my grandfather served this country and was wounded for this country, when he returned, he was still just another Negro that got to ride in the back of the bus. I don't know if it's the fact that we have been in a pandemic for over a year and a half, or if it's the fact that we are starting to reemerge into our next normal. But something has shifted for me. Something in me feels like there are some lessons that have come from this pandemic that I cannot forget once we fully re-enter spaces together. And if you aren't taking notes by now, then I invite you to start taking them now, because these are my 3 pandemic lessons. The first lesson I learned while interning here at UUCR: we can't go back to normal. We must create the next normal. Let me repeat that. We can't go back to normal. We must create the next normal. We knew that normal was broken. Normal was wrought with the stink of racism that has existed since the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm talking about the system that once it freed its enslaved people, it strongly suggested that those same newly free people stay with the same masters that beat, starved, and delivered all sorts of atrocities to them. They were encouraged as to not break up the systems of economics that were in place because the bigger picture of America needed them to continue to work. They needed them to continue the work that they had been bred to do. We can't go back to a normal that housed a system that funneled its Black and brown citizens into blue collar work and then degraded the blue collar work so that power and privilege were that of those who were educated and held white collar jobs. We can't go back to a normal that will only offer community care and mutual aid if you are living and working so far below the poverty line that you qualify as a houseless person. And we can't pretend anymore that we didn't see the vast income inequalities as those folks that work blue collar and fast food jobs were the ones who were once disposable, and now they have become essential. We can't go back and act like we don't know that there is a problem with our system when millions of people were impacted by the housing and rental markets, where folks lost their homes because of the ever increasing debt when they couldn't leave their homes to work. We also can't let go of the accessibility that has been created by being in a pandemic. I know that I have said this before, that it amazes me how fast these major companies adjusted their in-office policies of work so that we could work from home just so that their bottom lines weren't impacted, not ours. I'm going to say that part again. It amazes me how fast these major companies adjusted their in-office policies of work so that we could work from home just so that their bottom lines weren't impacted, not ours. Sikh activist Valarie Kaur asks us to ponder if this time we have been living in is a really long labor. And if it is, this next normal must be a result of the birth. The second lesson that I learned during this pandemic is that Americans don't really love America. I'm going to repeat that one too. Americans don't really love America. And that bit of wisdom comes from my young friend, Jason Martinez. We were having a discussion about what the next steps in America will look like as we transition from a Trump era presidency to a Biden era presidency. And I expanded his thought to include that Americans are more concerned with progress than the well-being of their citizens. And I think January 6th proved that Americans don't really love America. On January 6th, a gang of white supremacists stormed the capital of our nation to show the world that they were more concerned about their own self-interest than they were concerned about the country. If those folks were really patriots and really cared about this country, then they would have stayed home for the first 2 weeks of March last year, and they wouldn't have fought so hard to not wear a mask. Who remembers watching video after video on the news and on social media as people were exposed for yelling at the top of their lungs at service workers because they could not enter a store without a mask when there were rising cases of COVID-19? We have lost too many lives because people did not care enough to think beyond themselves, to care for themselves and shelter in place. And I know that it hasn't been easy to be at home. How many hugs did we miss? How many of us had to take on new roles, becoming full-time caregivers and tech support? How many of us had to overnight learn a new program and a new way to live? How many of us are feeling like we have lost some of our humanity by not being able to be with one another? How many handshakes and other ways that we share human touch were stolen from us in an instant? How many of us have lost someone because of COVID? And as we reemerge, I want us to consider that we have the opportunity to change and show that we as Americans can choose to show how much we love the United States of America by showing how much we love and care for one another. What would the world be like if we integrated these different ways of communication into our everyday lives? We're having partially virtual meetings and gatherings meant that we were expanding our tables and making room so that everyone can be present. And what if we saw that having these virtual avenues were about creating accessibility for our disabled siblings and also for our siblings who have to work these long hours at jobs, where you would have to do meetups to swap the kids with your spouse, where your moments of affection were more like ships passing one another in the night than a fleeting moment of an expression of love. What if we could change this feeling of being just a part of the system and instead we were a part of a larger picture of life that had a balance of work and life? The last lesson I learned during the pandemic is that consumerism is the root of all evil. And yes, I said it. I said evil. Over this last pandemic year, we have witnessed several instances where we had to question what happened to the faith and people in the United States. Who remembers at the beginning of this pandemic how there were runs on all grocery stores and markets, where all the beans and other non-perishables flew off the shelves? And for maybe the second time in my life, there was a shortage of toilet paper because the folks who had the most wealth decided they wanted to buy all of the products instead of leaving enough of a supply for their neighbors. Or how about a short month or so ago when there was an issue with the hacking of a pipeline and the whole East Coast and Southern states were brought to their most vulnerable state because folks were going to gas stations with empty oil drums so that they could overconsume the remaining gallons of gas. I think about the friends and some of you as congregants and the conversations we shared as you would travel to your local station to get gas, and yet you couldn't because the fuel tanks at each station were empty. I also think about the job disparities that are becoming ever so clear. How do we reconcile the fact that over 9.37 million people in the US were displaced by COVID-19, as reported by the Wall Street Journal? This shift in employment where folks have lost their jobs because companies can no longer just hold the work while we wait to emerge. I think about the rising numbers of small business folks who have had to close their businesses because they just were not making enough money to survive the pandemic. I also think about the other economies of the world and how we are progressing and getting ready to emerge. And many of these fragile economies are being set back by the years of progress that they made to try to catch up with us. Beloveds, these pandemic lessons are what I have been sitting with. And on this 4th of July, as I am remembering my grandfather and the price he was willing to pay, I find myself thinking about what were the prices we had to pay and still have to pay for this next generation to feel free. My prayer is that no matter how you feel about this day, whether you love it and honor it as a memory of our country declaring its independence, or if you hate it and hold on to the thought that America was declared free, but its people weren't, or if you are a beloved that holds this date with indifference, I pray that we can hold all of these truths because they are a part of who we are and where we've come from, but they do not dictate who we are yet to become. So my charge for you today is to go out from this place and know that we are just a seedling of a new nation we have yet to become. And each of us has the power to make this world better, one day at a time, and one heart at a time. And blessed may we all be. Ashe.